Ladies and gentlemen, anyone that manages to find 30 species of mammals, who puts himself out there on the cutting edge of the globe and says, I believe we need to have a council. I believe we need to do this. I believe we need to do that. That's vision. We don't always get it right. Some vision doesn't work. And I can read a really, really long introduction to our next speaker to deliver the keynote. And I'm tempted to not and cut it short so we can catch up some time. But instead, I'll just speak at 450 words a minute. Brace yourself. The climate emergency is now entering a crucial phase. Unless global emissions can be reduced 8% per year out to 2030, there is a high probability of reaching climate tipping points that will see an unstoppable slide to climate catastrophe. The Australian government's response to the COVID pandemic lays out a clear and viable response that could be applied to tackling the climate emergency. It involves 3 actions: reducing emissions, ensuring that we have sufficient capacity to cope with the unavoidable climatic deterioration, and seeking the equivalent of a vaccine by getting CO2 out of the atmosphere. Globally, transport is responsible for around 40% of emissions. Electrification, the use of hydrogen, and e-fuels will all be important as the sector transitions to zero emissions. Electric vehicles have a hugely important role to play in both public and private transport. An overview of clean energy in transport will be given. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Tim Flannery.
Look, thank you so much, John, for that great introduction, and a sincere thanks to Minister Ambrosio. I mean, Victoria is doing great things in terms of the energy transition, and I really do want to applaud the Minister for her really great work in that area. But what I wanted to do this morning, John, was particularly just take as a departure point your comment that you live near Cape Grim, that you are seeing about 412 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere there, and what that means for us in terms of dealing with the climate problem. Sadly, we've lost a decade really in terms of dealing with this problem, and CO2 emissions have been tracking a worst case scenario over that decade. And we are now very close to triggering some global tipping points that have the potential to accelerate the warming trend in ways that we can't do much about. So the key scientific paper that dealt with that issue was one by Tim Lenton and others, published in the journal Nature last year. I think it's one of the most important scientific papers ever published. And it said that we're very close to being committed to 1.5 degrees of warming at the moment globally. And what that's done is put us close to causing really serious deterioration in areas like permafrost melt. So the permafrost is close to getting to that runaway point where it'll continue melting and emitting methane and CO2 for a very long time. They also point to the fact that the Arctic Ocean, the frozen ice surface of the Arctic Ocean, is melting away. And every year there's less and less of it. And that means there's more dark surface ocean, which captures heat energy and melts the ice faster. And the year that ice doesn't form in summer will be a sort of signal year for the world, really, because it'll signal an acceleration of the warming trend. They also point to the fact that the Amazon rainforests are starting to die of drought. And because the Amazon feeds itself with rain, really, it's the transpiration of the moisture from the forest itself that produces more rain. That's another triggering event, which may cause massive dieback of that forest and increased warming as the plants die and decay and turn to CO2. So there's a series of tripping points, there are only a few that I've mentioned there, that we need to be really concerned about. And the best science we have tells us that we need, if we want to give ourselves the best chance of avoiding triggering those tipping points, we need to start cutting emissions right now at the rate of about 8% per year and continue doing so every year through to 2030. And that is a highly ambitious target. We've never achieved anything like it in the past, and it will take a singular focus by governments around the world to achieve that sort of action. This year, we've seen some quite extraordinary events. I think the unfolding of the COVID pandemic has been horrifying, damaging, but also instructional in some ways. I remember here in Australia, we had the government really trying to ignore the bushfires and climate change for a time in Australia, the mega fires. But once the COVID pandemic hit, there was something different, a different dynamic, and the government started listening to the scientists. And as a result, in February, we cut flights to China at great economic cost, well in advance of other nations doing similar things. And Australia declared a pandemic 12 days before the World Health Organization did so. We then entered a really serious lockdown that had big economic and social impacts, but which have led today to the situation where the nation's virtually COVID-free. So that series of actions, really, I watched on in amazement, and I thought, wow, if we could just do the same sort of thing with climate change, we would actually really get to where we need to get to and deal with this crisis. And if you tease apart the COVID pandemic, there really are only three actions that governments need to take to make sure they defeat that pandemic. The first is to stop the spread of the problem, right? And that's where you get this, so stop the spread, the first thing. The second thing we need to do is to make sure we've got enough capacity in our emergency systems to deal with all of the consequences we've triggered. So in terms of COVID, that meant to make sure we have enough emergency rooms, enough beds in the emergency rooms, that we had the tracing that was required to track down the source of the cases, and that we had enough doctors and nurses and ambulance drivers on the ground. In terms of climate change, there's a lot of casualties already. We've had the bushfires, we've seen the impacts that they've caused, about between $1 and $200 billion worth of infrastructure damage is estimated for those fires. We had 33 people die in the fires. We had 450 more die from the smoke inhalation from those fires. So all of those casualties, we have to understand that they're not going to be the last bushfires we see, that problem is going to grow. So the government needs to make sure we've got enough emergency capacity to deal with future bushfire casualties. We've got to make sure we've got enough capacity to deal with heatwave casualties. And we've got to look beyond that and look at our coasts with rising sea levels. What will the casualty rate in terms of infrastructure and so forth be there? What about the Great Barrier Reef? What do we need to do to give the Great Barrier Reef the best chance of survival in this age of accelerated warming? So any government has to really look at that whole thing and put that emergency response front and centre of its response to climate change. The third thing any government needs to do is to search for a vaccine, the ultimate cure for this. And I remember back in March, people were saying, well, we need to search for a vaccine, but it's going to be very expensive. It'll cost billions of dollars. It'll take a long time, and the results are uncertain. And that's true. But for climate change, we need to do the equivalent of search for a vaccine. And Sir David Attenborough, in his recent documentary, A Life on Earth, pointed so beautifully to what that vaccine consists of. It consists of allowing our Earth system to strengthen to the point where it can start absorbing all of that CO2 again and start bringing stability to the climate system. And we can do that through taking care of our forests, through taking care of our oceans, through growing kelp and seaweed in the oceans, through using things like silicate rocks, which are part of Earth's natural system for absorbing CO2. We can accelerate that by mining some of these rocks using clean technology and spreading them where they can absorb CO2 best. We can use things like direct air capture of CO2 to make useful things, plastics, e-fuels for aircraft and so forth, that are all part of that solution. But again, this is a long-term, ambitious, expensive program, but absolutely necessary to get us to a point of sustainability again. So that's really the program that we need any government to start looking at. And of course, transport is a massive part of that. It's not just road transport, the sort of stuff you guys deal with. It's the aircraft fleet. It's international shipping. It's public transport in terms of buses, electric buses maybe, trains and so forth. All of that has to be a major part of the solution. I think in terms of looking at that, at the potential solutions across the transport sector, when I look at it, there are some really viable solutions for some of the big parts of the problem. So in terms of global shipping, it seems pretty clear to me that hydrogen fuels are going to be the shape of the future there, and that we need to see significant investment in infrastructure that allows shipping to use hydrogen at ports. There are some vessels now being built to run on natural gas and so forth. I think we can almost skip that stage now. We're getting to the point where we've got enough clean energy infrastructure and there's enough interest in hydrogen that we can see hydrogen as a big part of the solution for shipping. In terms of aircraft, it's a more difficult problem. Probably the most difficult problem we face in terms of technical solutions is aviation. But one of the more promising innovations in that area is the development of e-fuels. I don't know whether you guys have heard of these, but they are currently being produced by a company called Carbon Engineering in Canada. They're made by using electrolysis to free hydrogen and then combining that hydrogen with captured CO2 to produce very energy dense fuels, which are free of any pollutants such as sulfur and so forth. So these are actually available now on the market. They're more expensive than traditional fuels, but they nevertheless, sorry, can you guys hear me again? I hope I'm just getting, they nevertheless are there and are in use. And we can see the uptake of those e-fuels in future will be a very, very important element in terms of bringing carbon neutrality to aviation. In terms of on-road transport, electric buses, as Lily Ambrosio said, really important part of the future and probably one of the most simple parts to bring in very, very rapidly because they run on a known route. You can match battery size to recharging and do electric buses in a very, very smart manner. For electric vehicles, we know what we need to have for that industry to work. And among the things that I've seen, I'm sure that you're well aware of, we need greater choice in Australia of electric vehicles. We need a larger number of models to cater for the variety of uses that electric vehicles will be put for in this country. I think last time I looked, we had about 4 models widely available in Australia. Compared with Europe, at the end of this year, I think there's something like 150 models available. So we need more models. We also need to really start pushing electric vehicles into fleet sales, as many of you guys know. Fleet vehicles are really the kind of engine house of the second-hand market for vehicles in Australia. So if we can push more EVs into fleet sales, we will be doing a good job in terms of creating a market for used vehicles in Australia. One of the biggest problems we have in terms of those fleet sales, though, is the way that the fringe benefit tax is crafted in this country. So you get a fringe benefit tax for the fuel you burn and all of your servicing on your old antique fossil fueled vehicle, but you don't get the equivalent for your electric vehicle. So we need to see pretty profound structural reform around FBT, fringe benefit tax in this country, to allow electric vehicle uptake in that market. And I think I wish the Minister was still here for that, but it's a message that we need to hear at a political level, I think very loud and clear. Things like the luxury car tax, of course, are working also against electric vehicles. I heard what the Minister said about the new tax coming into Victoria in terms of electric vehicle usage. I'm concerned about that. I think the time is just not right for that because what we're aiming for now is rapid uptake. We need that 8% per year, and we're not going to get that if we put roadblocks in the way at this very early stage. So to me, in summary, we're in a true emergency situation now in terms of climate change. We need to use all of the levers we can to get that 8% reduction per year. Australia also needs to start leading globally because it's not just our nation that's going to be acting. The Glasgow climate meeting in October next year is going to be the key moment where, if Australia comes to that well prepared with a series of proposals that run for everything from stationary energy through to transport, through to global transport such as shipping and so forth, we could be an absolute game changer because up to now we've played a spoiling role really in those meetings. It is entirely possible that we could actually start doing something very constructive, particularly with the Biden presidency in place. We have so few years really to deal with this problem now. If we dally and leave this for another decade, we'll be committed to 2 degrees of warming, and that will almost certainly trigger multiple Earth tipping points. And once you've done that, nothing you do afterwards counts for anything, because those tipping points cause accelerated warming that human activity can never catch up with. So I just want to leave you with the thought that this is the critical moment for this generation and future generations. The sort of actions that we take now and that the progress your industry makes now will weigh disproportionately heavily in the future of our future, for our children, and for everyone that lives subsequently. So I hope we can really energise in Australia and globally to make this transition as timely a manner as possible. You know, people talk about an orderly transition, and that often means a slow economic transition. The trouble with that argument is it causes a disorderly transition in our climate, right? The climate has to come first and foremost, as we learned through the COVID pandemic. We make the investments that are required today for a much better future, but we have to do that now. We can't leave it. We can't leave it beyond this year. So thank you very much. I wish you all the very best with your conference and with your industry in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Flannery. Fantastic as always. Your message is insightful and your vaccine is both awareness and action. May we soldier on as fast as we can.